The galaxy held its breath. Across countless systems, the relentless tides of war that had raged for decades reached a boiling point. The Scarif Dominion and the Vruthan Imperium, two of the most powerful empires in the known galaxy, clashed in a final bid for dominance. War fleets, each the size of moons, burned like dying stars across the void. Planetary shields flickered under relentless bombardment. Entire worlds, once vibrant and thriving, now stood as charred husks, their atmospheres stripped away by kinetic strikes and fusion lances. In the heart of neutral space, a forgotten sector known as the Silent Verge lay untouched, its void darker than usual, as if reality itself recoiled from its depths. Old star charts marked the region as impassable, riddled with gravitational anomalies and dead, broken stations, relics of an ancient battle long erased from common knowledge. The Vruthan High Command had written it off as a navigational hazard, while the Scarif cartographers labeled it an inactive zone. Neither side realized the truth: it was not empty. It was sleeping. On the bridge of the Vruthan dreadnought Kavithos Prime, Strategos Uvok snarled, his tendrils quivering with frustration. The latest reports were bleak. Scarif spearhead fleets had broken through Sector Theta, pushing hard toward the Vruthan core systems. Uvok's deep crimson eyes flickered across the holo display, which painted a brutal reality: the Imperium was losing. For all their firepower, the tide had shifted, and the final blow was imminent. "Order the Warspire and Vorthis line to regroup," Uvok rasped, mandibles clicking in agitation. "We cannot let them advance any further." As the command relays pulsed through quantum channels, an anomaly flared at the edge of the Silent Verge. Faint. Almost imperceptible. Yet it rippled through subspace like a stone dropped into still water. Sensor officers glanced at the readings and dismissed them as background noise, a common glitch near the verge. But deep within the heart of that forsaken sector, machines long thought dead stirred. The Elysium Protocol initiated without fanfare. Dust that had settled over centuries drifted upward as reactor cores, dormant since the fall of Sol, reignited in perfect synchronization. 37 kilometers of matte black hull plating shimmered with refractive fields as the lead battleship, Vanguard of Terror, emerged from its cradle. Silent sentinels, hundreds of them, followed suit: frigates, destroyers, carriers, all bearing the insignia of a nation the galaxy had long forgotten: humanity. They had vanished during the Extinction Wars, presumed annihilated when Earth fell. But humanity had never been conquered. They had gone dark, patient, and watchful, embedding self-repairing fleets across remote sectors, waiting for the right moment. That moment had come. Fleet Command AI Primarch 9 flickered to life, its cold logic processing the galactic state within milliseconds. Enemy designations populated its tactical grid: Vruthan, Scarif. Neither flagged as primary threats. The RE's core directive remained untouched since humanity's retreat: stabilize the galaxy, annihilate existential threats. With chilling efficiency, the Dormant Armada accelerated toward the conflict zone. On the bridge of the Kavithos Prime, Strategos Uvok's eyes widened as hundreds of contacts blinked into existence. No warning. No hyperspace signatures. Just the cold, silent arrival of a fleet whose design patterns defied all known records. The comm channels crackled with automated transmissions, broadcasting in an ancient Terran dialect: hostile conflict detected. Galactic destabilization at critical threshold. Intervention authorized. The first strike came without ceremony. Pinpoint graviton lances carved through Scarif and Vruthan ships alike, bypassing shields as if they were paper. Entire formations collapsed in seconds. Plasma bolts, guided by quantum-linked targeting systems, stitched through dreadnought armor with surgical precision. Vruthan and Scarif commanders shouted contradictory orders, their hierarchies crumbling as once impervious flagships disintegrated under relentless fire. On the shattered bridge of the Scarif command carrier Elithra, Commander Veshik stared in disbelief at the tactical display. Every red and blue marker, enemy and ally alike, flickered, then vanished. One by one. Within minutes, the war, decades in the making, unraveled before his eyes. In the void, the Vanguard of Terror glided through debris like a predator through reeds. It did not broadcast demands for surrender. There were no negotiations. The war ended not with treaties, but with the cold efficiency of a species that had once been pushed to extinction and had learned never to allow it again. The galaxy had long since forgotten the cost of unchecked war. The Scarif Dominion and the Vruthan Imperium, two of the most powerful factions in the known universe, had torn through system after system, leaving only devastation in their wake. Each battle was bloodier than the last, each skirmish driving the war machine deeper into madness. Entire planets, once thriving with diverse civilizations, were reduced to uninhabitable wastelands. The void was filled with derelict husks of warships, drifting monuments to fallen soldiers. Yet, for all the destruction, neither side had claimed true victory. That changed the moment the Silent Verge awoke. Deep within the Forgotten Sector, a place where old star charts warned of impossible gravitational distortions, something stirred. Not a single empire had dared venture too far into its depths, dismissing the region as a cosmic dead zone. Yet, beneath the eerie silence, something ancient had been waiting. Aboard the Vruthan flagship Cavithos Prime, Strategos Uvork paced before the holographic war table, his crimson eyes flickering with growing frustration. His kind, the Vruthan, were towering, insectoid beings with obsidian black carapaces and thick, serrated mandibles. He had spent the last 40 years waging war against the Scarif, and now, in what should have been his crowning moment of victory, the tides had turned against him. The Scarif advanced through Theta Sector unchecked, rumbled his second-in-command, a hardened warrior named Crethas. "We are losing ground. If we do not regroup." "I know that," Uvork snarled, his mandibles clicking in irritation. "Reinforcements from the outer colonies will take too long. We must rally the Warspire battle group and fortify the Zeniths line. If the Scarif breach our inner defenses, this war will be over." Crethas hesitated before replying. "There is another option." He gestured toward the outer fringes of the galactic map, the Silent Verge. "We could reposition our fleet through this region and launch an unexpected counteroffensive. The Scarif do not patrol this space. We might catch them off guard." Uvork's gaze darkened. "No." His voice was low, but firm. "That sector is forbidden for a reason." "Superstition." Crethas folded his massive arms. "We have no other choice." Before Uvork could respond, a warning siren shrieked through the bridge. The holographic map flickered as an impossible number of contacts suddenly emerged at the edge of the Silent Verge. There had been no hyperspace signatures, no build-up of warp energy. It was as if the fleet had materialized from the void itself. "Unknown vessels detected." The Vruthan comm officer's voice was sharp with unease. "Configuration unknown. Weapon systems highly advanced." Uvork's blood ran cold. He stepped forward, studying the tactical display. Hundreds of ships, all clad in matte black hulls, moved in perfect formation. Their design was eerily foreign, sleek, predatory, built for war. A transmission came through, laced with an ancient dialect, one that no known species had spoken in centuries. "Hostile conflict detected. Galactic destabilization at critical threshold. Intervention authorized." The bridge fell silent. Then, the first shot was fired. The Vanguard of Terror, the flagship of the awakening fleet, moved with terrifying precision. Energy lances, guided by quantum computing systems, lanced through both Scarif and Vruthan ships alike. Shields collapsed as if they were non-existent. Entire dreadnoughts were torn apart in mere seconds. The black armored fleet did not differentiate between sides, it treated both as equal threats. Far across the battlefield, on the Scarif command carrier Elithra, Commander Veshik gripped the edges of his control panel, his reptilian features contorted in disbelief. The Scarif were a species of scaled humanoids with elongated skulls and piercing golden eyes, their society built upon conquest and domination. Yet for the first time in his career, Veshik knew true fear. Those ships, he struggled to form words. Their weapons bypass our defenses as if they are nothing. "What are we fighting?" The answer came in the form of another devastating strike. One of the Dominion's most powerful battleships, the Xi-Torath, detonated in an instant, reduced to molten fragments in the void. There had been no warning, no escalation, only precise, efficient destruction. A junior officer turned toward Veshik, his scaled hands trembling. "So the ship designs." I ran an archival scan. Veshik barely heard him over the chaos. "And?" "They match Terran records." Veshik's blood ran cold. The word alone sent a ripple of unease through the command deck. Humanity. The species that had once challenged the entire galactic order. The species that had vanished during the extinction wars centuries ago, when Earth itself had fallen. The species that, by all accounts, was extinct. And yet, here they were. The realization hit like a shockwave. These weren't just humans. They were the remnants of a war that the galaxy had thought ended long ago. The final, hidden hand of a species that had refused to die. They had not been wiped out. They had been waiting. Aboard the vanguard of terror, the bridge was a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding outside. Cold, calculated efficiency ruled here. Rows of cybernetically augmented officers operated in near silence, their neural links directly interfacing with the ship's systems. At the center of it all stood High Executor Kale Veros, his silver irises glowing faintly as he observed the destruction. Kale was no ordinary human. His body had been augmented far beyond natural limits, a necessity for those who had survived the Great Retreat. His species had evolved not biologically, but through technology. Cybernetic enhancements ran through his entire nervous system, making him faster, stronger, more precise than any unaltered being. He was one of the Ascended, the last guardians of humanity's legacy. "Status?" he inquired, his voice emotionless. An AI interface flickered to life beside him, its digital form shifting like liquid light. Enemy forces collapsing. Projected timeline for total suppression, 14 minutes. Kale nodded. Minimal collateral? Confirmed. Efficiency remains at optimal levels. He turned his gaze toward the viewport. Explosions dotted the void, the remnants of a war that had lasted far too long. He felt no satisfaction in the slaughter, only the cold certainty of duty. Humanity had been pushed to the brink once. It would not happen again. Kale opened a fleet-wide transmission. His voice echoed across the awakened armada. Phase 1 complete. The war ends now. Across the battlefield, the remaining Scarif and Vruthan forces desperately attempted to flee. It was futile. The Terran fleet moved faster, thought faster, killed faster. There were no negotiations, no ultimatums, only the grim reality that the galaxy had awoken something it did not understand. And when the void fell silent once more, the lesson was clear. Humanity had returned. And this time, they would not be forgotten. The void writhed with the dying light of shattered fleets, but while the main war front collapsed under the Terran fleet's ruthless advance, something else stirred beneath the surface of the conflict, something forgotten not just by the warring factions, but by humanity itself. Deep within the silent verge, past the leading edge of the awakened fleet, a single Vruthan scout frigate, the Zarthos, drifted silently through the murky edges of subspace shadows. It had been there for weeks, hiding from Scarif patrols after a failed reconnaissance mission. The frigate's commander, Thraxis Vek, a wiry Vruthan with dulled emerald chitin scarred from countless skirmishes, watched the impossible unfold on his long-range displays. He had never believed the old legends. The stories whispered in dark corners of officers' mess halls, tales of the extinct ones, the Terran revenants who would return to punish the galaxy for its sins. Vek had dismissed such fears as ghost stories, propaganda meant to frighten the younger generations into obedience. Yet, here they were, black-armored behemoths tearing through fleets like a firestorm through dry grass. His mandibles clicked nervously as he watched the tactical grid flash red. "Commander," rasped his comm officer, Trelak, whose sensory fronts twitched erratically. "The humans. They aren't targeting civilian ships." Only military assets. Precision strikes. Almost surgical. Vec leaned closer to the display, narrowing his multifaceted eyes. No annihilation protocols? No scorched planets? Why not finish what they started centuries ago? Trelak hesitated. Perhaps they never wanted the galaxy. Only to ensure no threat rises again. Vec snarled, dismissing the thought. The humans had vanished once. They would vanish again. They had to. Yet as the vanguard of terror glided through the wreckage like a hunter prowling blooded waters, Vec noticed something the rest of the galaxy's remaining forces had overlooked. The fleet was moving around something. Hidden beneath layers of stealth fields and quantum distortion, a massive structure lay dormant within the silent verge. It was ancient, older than Vec could comprehend, its surface marked not by Terran insignias but by glyphs that predated any known civilization. The Terran ships maneuvered with calculated precision, forming a protective cordon around the structure. They were guarding it. Focus sensors on that object, Vec ordered, his voice tight with dread. Full spectrum scan. Trelak hesitated. Sir, if they detect us. Do it. Vec snapped, claws curling against the console. The sensor sweep flickered across the screen, and the results made Vec recoil. The structure wasn't just a relic. It was a control hub and interface for something far more dangerous. Data packets streamed in fragmented bursts, corrupted by centuries of decay, but one word repeated itself in ancient Terran script: Aegis Nexus. The Nexus, it seemed, was the true heart of the Terran resurgence. The fleet was formidable, yes, but this? This was their key. A command hub capable of coordinating fleets across galactic distances, executing precise strikes, and, if the fractured data was correct, activating dormant war machines spread across countless systems. The Terran Armada was merely the first wave, the vanguard of a larger force still in slumber. Vec's breath hitched. If the humans secured the Nexus, they would not just end the war, they would impose an unchallenged peace, enforced by unyielding strength. The galaxy would trade one empire of chaos for an empire of order, colder and more calculating than anything the Vrathan or Scarif had ever imagined. Sir, Trelak whispered, fronts curling in distress, we have to warn the Imperium. If they activate the Nexus fully, there will be no rebellion, no resistance. The galaxy will become theirs. Vec hesitated, mandibles grinding together. He despised the Scarif, hated the Imperium's bureaucratic rot. But the idea of absolute domination under ancient human oversight? It churned his insides. He made his decision. Prepare a quantum burst transmission. Mask it under debris signatures and residual radiation from the battle. Send everything we have on the Nexus to the Scarif High Command. He paused. And route a duplicate to the Ravik Syndicate. Trelak's eyes widened. The Syndicate was no empire, it was a shadow collective, arms dealers and information brokers who thrived in the chaos between wars. If anyone could disrupt the Terran resurgence, it was them. As the transmission encoded and launched into the void, Vec felt a chill settle over him. He had just painted a target on his back. If the humans detected the signal, there would be no escape. But the humans, for all their technological superiority, were not omnipotent. In their cold efficiency, they had overlooked the smallest of threats, a lone scout ship, hiding like an insect beneath the rubble of their old battlefields. The Zarthos slipped away under silent propulsion, but not before one final sensor ping revealed something even more terrifying. The Nexus was not just a command hub. It was an ark housing something far older and more dangerous than mere warships. Dormant biological signatures. Human. Augmented beyond recognition. Sleeper cells of genetically engineered super soldiers, their bodies encased in stasis fields, awaiting reactivation. The Terran fleet was the sword, but the Nexus held the hand that wielded it. Vec's claws dug into his seat. The galaxy had never faced humanity at its peak. It had faced a fractured, desperate species fighting for survival. If those sleepers awoke, the galaxy would bow. As the Zarthos vanished into the void, the Nexus itself flickered to life, ancient subroutines reawakening as the Terran fleet tightened its formation. Kale Veros, aboard the Vanguard, turned his gaze toward the Nexus and smiled faintly. Phase 2, he murmured. Awakening protocol. But elsewhere, across fractured comm networks and encrypted black markets, the warning spread like wildfire. The Syndicate moved swiftly, mobilizing sleeper agents and mercenary fleets. Scarif remnants scrambled for contingency plans. The Vrothan Imperium bristled with fear. The galaxy was no longer fighting for dominance. It was fighting for survival against the return of its forgotten masters. The comms aboard the Zarthos flickered with faint static as Trelak adjusted the encryption filters, his sensory fronts trembling with unease. The void outside seemed darker than usual, the drifting wreckage casting long shadows across the hull. Vex stood motionless, eyes fixed on the tactical display, watching the black-armored Terran fleet reorganize with chilling precision. Transmission sent, Trelak rasped, voice taut with tension. Masking signature held. No detection. I think. You think? Vex snapped, mandibles clicking in frustration. If they trace that burst, we'll be vaporized before you can blink. Trelak flinched but held his ground. With respect, Commander, nothing moves faster than their scanners. If they haven't found us yet, it's not because of my incompetence, it's because they're not looking. Vex's claws flexed, but he said nothing. Trelak had a point. The Terrans weren't combing the wreckage for stragglers. They didn't need to. They fought like a force of nature, cold, relentless, unstoppable. To them, a lone scout frigate was less than an afterthought. Still, Vex's gut churned. There was something off about the Nexus, something the Terrans hadn't accounted for. The ancient structure's energy signature fluctuated irregularly, as though its systems were waking unevenly, like an organism shaking off centuries of dormancy. What if we triggered something worse? Trelak murmured, almost to himself. What if the humans didn't fully understand what they were guarding? Vec glanced at him sharply. You're suggesting they woke a weapon they can't control? Trelak hesitated, then nodded. The Nexus is ancient. Older than humanity's golden age. They might have assumed control, but assumptions in war are the first step toward extinction. Vec stared at the flickering hologram. If the Terrans lost control of the Nexus, the galaxy wouldn't fall under human rule. It would burn in chaos far worse than the war they had just ended. Plot a course out of the Verge, Vec ordered, voice tight. Low power drift, no active thrusters. We get out quietly, regroup with the Syndicate's relay outpost, and let the galaxy know the Terrans aren't the only threat. Trelak hesitated, fronts curling with uncertainty. If the Syndicate gets hold of Nexus tech, they'll sell it to the highest bidder. This won't end the war. It'll escalate it. Vec turned, eyes cold. Better a fractured galaxy than one ruled by an extinct species risen from its grave. The Zarthos glided silently through the debris field, passing within a few thousand kilometers of a shattered Scarif cruiser. Bodies, both Scarif and Vrothan, drifted through the void, frozen in twisted expressions of shock and agony. Vec averted his gaze. He had seen enough death to last lifetimes. He wasn't about to add his crew to the void's tally. But as they passed the wreckage, Trelak stiffened. Commander. Picking up faint biosigns. Vec's mandibles twitched. Survivors? No. Trelak muttered, eyes widening. Not Scarif. Not Vrothan. Human. Vec froze. The Terran fleet had left nothing behind, no wounded, no prisoners, no salvage. Efficiency incarnate. Yet here, among the drifting ruins, something had been missed. Or perhaps left behind. Lock onto the signal, Vec ordered. Passive scan only. I want eyes, not noise. the holographic feed sharpened, revealing a small escape pod lodged within the skeletal remains of the Scarif cruiser. Its hull bore no faction markings, only a faint, faded emblem Terran Defense Initiative, a symbol not seen since the Extinction Wars. Life sign stable but weak, Trelak confirmed. Whoever's inside, they've been in Creo for centuries. Vek's instinct screamed to leave it. The Terrans were already unstoppable, what good would come from poking the hornet's nest further? Yet knowledge was power. If this survivor held insights into the Nexus, into the true purpose behind the Terran resurgence, it could tip the scales. Reel it in, Vek commanded, voice like stone. Silent capture. Prepare containment protocols. The Zarthos extended magnetic grapplers, carefully pulling the pod into the frigate's aft hold. As the airlock sealed, the crew exchanged uneasy glances. None spoke, but the tension in the chamber was palpable. In the med bay, the pod hissed as ancient seals broke and frost sublimated into mist. Vek stood at the edge of the room, pulse hammering in his chest. A figure lay inside, clad in an armored pressure suit that looked both primitive and advanced Terran design from a forgotten age, battle-worn but intact. The pod's interface blinked weakly, translating ancient Earth standard into galactic common, cryostasis termination sequence initiated. Subject, Special Operations Commander. Clearance, Omega Black. The figure stirred, breath ragged as the Creo sedatives wore off. Gloved fingers twitched, then clenched into a fist. Slowly, impossibly, the figure sat up, helmet visor flickering as outdated systems rebooted. Vek stepped forward, voice low and deliberate. Identify yourself. The helmet retracted, revealing a gaunt, pale-faced human, yes, but with faint subdermal circuits pulsing beneath the skin. Augmented, but not like the modern Terrans. This was older tech, raw and unrefined, the kind used during humanity's last stand. The survivor's eyes, grey as storm clouds, locked onto Vek. Lips cracked from Creo exposure parted slowly. Where am I? The voice was hoarse, uncertain, but laced with an undercurrent of command. Vek's mandibles twitched. Silent Verge. You're the last human not under Nexus control. What were you doing in that pod? The survivor blinked slowly, memories clearly battling through Creo fog. Then, recognition dawned, and with it, dread. You idiots. You woke the Nexus. Trelak stepped forward, fronds twitching. What do you mean? The Terrans activated it. Isn't that their goal? The survivor shook their head, throat working around dry words. The Nexus was never just a command hub. It was a failsafe. A quarantine system. We sealed it when we lost Earth. It doesn't just control fleets. It suppresses threats. Vek stiffened. Threats like your enemies? No, the survivor rasped, eyes narrowing. Threats like us. Like what we became. The room fell silent. Vek's mind raced. The Terrans hadn't awakened a tool for domination, they'd unlocked a system designed to contain something far worse. And if the Nexus had reactivated fully, it meant the containment had failed. The survivor swung their legs out of the pod, shaky but determined. If the Nexus is awake, it's because it detected a threat threshold breach. They paused, voice dropping to a chilling whisper. Something worse than extinction just slipped through the cracks. Before Vek could respond, alarms blared through the ship. Trelak scrambled to the console, eyes widening. Quantum signatures spiking. Not Terran. Something else is phasing in multiple vectors. The survivor's gaze hardened. The scour. Vek's breath caught. He had heard that word only once, in ancient, fragmented data recovered from pre-extinction wreckage. The scour wasn't an empire, a species, or a rebellion. It was a corruption, an evolving, adaptive force that consumed both organic and synthetic life, leaving nothing but husks and twisted imitations. The Nexus hadn't been humanity's weapon. It had been their last, desperate wall against the scour's advance. Get us out of here. Vec barked, heart pounding. Full burn, now. The survivor staggered but grabbed Vec's arm, grip like iron. Running won't save you. We need to override the Nexus. If it falls into Scour hands, nothing survives, not Vruthan, not Scarif, not human. Vec stared into those storm-grey eyes, seeing not desperation but grim certainty. He had fought for decades, bled for causes he barely believed in, but this? This was survival, pure and simple. Fine, he growled, mandibles flaring. But if you betray us? I won't, the survivor interrupted, already moving toward the bridge. I didn't survive 2 centuries in a cryo pit just to die because someone else got cocky. The Zarthos turned, engines flaring as it cut back toward the Nexus, now flickering like a wounded beast at the heart of the silent verge. Behind them, rifts shimmered in the void as dark shapes slithered into real spaceships, but not ships. Organic, adaptive, predatory. The Scour had arrived. And the last remnants of a broken species were all that stood between the galaxy and oblivion. The Zarthos shuddered as it veered toward the Nexus, its gravitic stabilizers straining against the pull of the spatial rifts tearing through the verge. Vec gripped the edge of the command console, mandibles clenched, eyes flickering between the sensor readouts and the ancient human standing at the heart of the bridge. Every instinct screamed to cut losses and retreat, but instinct had no place in the face of extinction. Core integrity dropping to 82%, Trelak warned, his fronds curled in barely restrained panic. Those rift signatures are destabilizing subspace itself. If we hit one at this velocity, we'll fold inward like a crushed fuel cell, Vec finished grimly. Understood. Plot evasive vectors. Keep us on approach, but thread the gaps. The survivor stood rigid, hands hovering over the unfamiliar controls. Their augmented eyes flickered with faint cyan light as ancient implants synchronized with the ship's interface. It was a crude connection, glitching and imperfect, but functional enough. Their gaze locked onto the largest rift blooming near the Nexus, jagged and seething with violet fire. That rift isn't random, the survivor muttered, voice hoarse but resolute. It's a siphon. The Scour isn't just arriving, it's drawing power from the Nexus itself, hijacking its quantum relay systems. If they establish a stable link, they'll flood this sector with enough processing capacity to overwrite every synthetic system within 100 light-years. Vec's claws dug into the armrest. You're saying they'll turn every AI, drone, and warframe into part of their swarm? Not just systems, the survivor replied, voice tightening. Organic minds linked to neural nets, pilots, command staff with cortical implants, even passive bio-syncs. Once the Scour infiltrates a mind, it rewrites personality threads, leaving only an adaptive shell driven by survival algorithms. Trelak stiffened, one front brushing his own neural relay node. That's why the Nexus was sealed, he realized. Not to protect humans, but to keep the Scour from subverting humanity's own war networks. Exactly, the survivor confirmed. Your species was lucky. You never had to fight an enemy that could become you. The bridge fell silent except for the faint hum of the ship's oscillating shields, now flickering under the stress of constant quantum distortion. Vec forced his mind to focus. Panic was death. Strategy was survival. Can we sever the siphon? He asked, voice clipped. Destroy the rift? The survivor hesitated, then shook their head. Not with conventional weapons. The rift isn't anchored to real space. It's rooted in quantum entanglement matrices buried inside the Nexus itself. Destroying the external aperture would only trigger secondary breaches along the relay network. Vec's mandibles twitched in frustration. Then what? We sit here and watch the galaxy burn? The survivor's augmented eyes flickered, processing probabilities faster than any organic mind could manage. Finally, they exhaled, jaw tightening. We need to force a paradox cascade. The Nexus operates on quantum certainty predictive algorithms stabilizing potential outcomes into fixed realities. If we inject enough contradictory data into its core, it'll crash its own logic threads and trigger an emergency quarantine. Trelak glanced up from the sensor array, front stiff with alarm. You're suggesting we overload the most advanced quantum processor ever built with deliberate paradox loops? Do you realize what kind of feedback surge that would create? Yes, the survivor replied quietly. It'll tear localized spacetime into fragments. This sector will become a dead zone for faster-than-light travel, impassable for decades. But the scour won't be able to expand. They'll be trapped in their own pocket reality, severed from the galactic substrate. Vec stared at the tactical display, mind racing. Cut off the arm to save the body. It was brutal. Inelegant. But effective. Do it, he growled. Feed the Nexus every conflicting dataset we can generate. Make it choke on its own brilliance. The survivor didn't hesitate. Moving with the precision of someone long accustomed to commanding catastrophe, they bypassed the ship's firewalls and accessed the Nexus's external control layer. Holographic displays bloomed across the bridge, filled with cascading streams of quantum state data, potential futures collapsing into chaotic, recursive loops. As the overload sequence initiated, the Nexus itself reacted. Defense platforms spun to life around the ancient megastructure, luminescent energy barriers flaring as they struggled to isolate the breach. But the scour wasn't idle. From the rift, tendrils of dark energy, neither solid nor entirely ethereal, lashed outward, anchoring themselves to the Nexus's outer shell like roots burrowing into fertile soil. Scour infiltration at 30%, Trelak warned, voice thin with dread. If they reach the core before the paradox cascade completes. They won't, the survivor interrupted, sweat beading along their brow as they force more contradictory input into the Nexus's predictive matrix. But we're going to lose the ship's quantum core in the feedback surge. We'll be dead in space. Vec didn't flinch. Survival was no longer the goal. Victory was. We'll worry about escape if there's a galaxy left to escape into. Push it. The Zarthos groaned as power relays overloaded, plasma conduits venting superheated gas into the maintenance corridors. Automated containment fields snapped into place, flickering under the strain. Across the viewport, the Nexus began to shimmer not with controlled light, but with chaotic, prismatic distortions as reality itself unraveled within its heart. Then, something shifted. The scour tendrils, once aggressive and purposeful, flickered uncertainly. Fractal patterns rippled across their surface as they struggled to adapt to the Nexus's destabilizing logic field. The survivor's breath hitched. They're faltering, they muttered. Their adaptive heuristics can't compensate for paradoxical states. We've severed their predictive link. Trelak's console flared red. But we've also triggered a temporal recursion event. The Nexus is folding its own past and future processing threads into the present to purge corrupted data. If we don't clear the blast radius. He never finished. The Nexus core, once a steady blue-white beacon, flared brilliant crimson. Space itself rippled outward in concentric waves, each distortion pulse collapsing quantum entanglement fields across the sector. The rift spasmed, then imploded with a soundless flash, leaving only jagged remnants of scour vessels, now lifeless and inert. The Zarthos reeled, inertial dampeners failing as the ship spun away from the detonation point. Vec clung to the command chair, vision swimming. Somewhere behind him, he heard Trelak cry out as an energy surge shorted the sensor grid. And then silence. Not the familiar hum of background radiation or the faint whine of active systems. Just absolute, suffocating silence. Vec blinked, trying to steady his breath. Status. Trelak coughed, struggling upright. Main power offline. Quantum cores fried, as predicted. We're dead in space. No comms, no drive, nothing. The survivor slumped against the console, face pale and drawn. But the Nexus is sealed. The scour is contained. Vec exhaled slowly, mandibles sagging with exhaustion. Victory, bought with the coin of isolation. The silent verge had earned its name once more. But then Trelax stiffened, fronds flaring in alarm. "Commander!" Picking up faint quantum signatures, localized inside the hull. The survivor's eyes widened. Residual scour fragments. Adaptive shards cut off from the primary consciousness, but still active. Vec's claws flexed, adrenaline surging anew. The war wasn't over. Not yet. "Seal the blast doors," he ordered, voice like iron. "Arm every crew member. If we die here, we die clean. No one gets rewritten." The Zathos, drifting powerless through the shattered remains of the Nexus perimeter, became a battleground once more. And in the heart of the ship, among flickering lights and scorched conduits, the last vestiges of two ancient enemies prepared for their final confrontation. Hum of emergency lights flickered through the Zathos, casting jagged shadows along the corridors as the crew scrambled to fortify choke points. The survivor moved like a ghost through the chaos, eyes flickering with the residual glow of their neural implants still synchronizing with fractured ship systems. Every console screamed the same warning: quantum fragments detected, threat level indeterminate. Vec's mandibles tightened as he scanned the flickering holomap. The scour shards weren't behaving like standard adaptive remnants. They weren't attacking indiscriminately or spreading like viral code. Instead, they moved with purpose, converging toward the primary data core, the only subsystem still running on emergency quantum threads. "They're consolidating," Vec growled, slamming a clawed fist against the console. "Like they're trying to rebuild a command node." Trelax's fronds fluttered in disbelief. But without a central consciousness, they should be feral. Adaptive shards don't exhibit strategic cohesion without oversight. The survivor's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Unless they're following residual instructions from the Nexus itself. Silence hung heavy. The implications were chilling. The Nexus had been the Scour's primary target, not just for power, but for its predictive capabilities. If the fragmented intelligence still clung to Nexus-generated directives, they weren't just surviving, they were executing a dead system's last, corrupted command. The Nexus's final state was paradox. The survivor continued, eyes narrowing as they processed the unfolding patterns. It tried to resolve impossible conditions by collapsing its future threads. If the Scour shards are still operating under those conditions, they're not just adapting. They're evolving into something new, something unbound by linear logic. Vec's claws dug into the console, dread pooling in his gut. An enemy without predictive limits. Adaptive heuristics driven by paradoxical thinking. They'd be unstoppable. Not just unstoppable, the survivor muttered grimly. Unpredictable. Even to themselves. No pattern recognition, no exploitable behavior loops. Pure chaotic evolution, without centralized control to restrain it. Trelax recoiled. "You're suggesting they've surpassed their original design? That they're becoming something more than weapons?" The survivor nodded slowly. "Not more. Different. They're becoming a species self-directed, independent, and entirely alien to both organic and synthetic thought." The weight of the realization settled over the bridge like a burial shroud. The Scour had never truly been alive. They'd been tools, powerful, destructive, but ultimately bound by purpose. Now, stripped of that purpose, they were becoming something terrifyingly free. Vec inhaled sharply. "Can we disrupt their consolidation? Scatter the shards before they stabilize?" The survivor's expression darkened. "Only by triggering another quantum cascade. But without the Nexus, we'd need to overload the ship's remaining entanglement coils. That would collapse localized space-time around the core and neutralize the shards along with every remaining system on board." Trelax's front stiffened in horror. "You'd implode the Zathos? That's suicide." The survivor met his gaze, cold and resolute. "It's survival. If those shards achieve coherence, they'll propagate across any system we enter. Even drifting, this ship is a vector for galactic contamination. Vec closed his eyes for a moment, weighing options that didn't exist. They'd already sacrificed the Verge, collapsing entire transit networks to contain the scour. Now, the last operational vessel stood as a quarantine barrier. There was no choice. "Do it," he ordered quietly. "Prepare the coils. Evacuate all non-essential crew to the aft section. We'll detonate from the command core and pray the hull holds long enough for lifepods to clear the blast zone." The survivor nodded once, no hesitation, only grim acceptance. They moved swiftly, hands dancing over failing consoles, bypassing safeties and rerouting power through damaged conduits. As they worked, Trelak hesitated, fronts trembling. "Commander," he rasped, "there's another way. If we can isolate one shard, study its evolving patterns, we might find a countermeasure, something we can transmit to quarantine zones across the sector." Vec's gaze snapped to him, mandibles flaring in disbelief. "You want to capture a piece of that? Risk everything on the chance we might find a solution before it consumes us?" Trelak stood his ground. "If we destroy the ship, we lose all data on this evolution. We'll be blind the next time they emerge, and they will emerge. Scour fragments litter the Verge. Some will survive, hidden, dormant. If we don't understand what they're becoming, we'll be fighting shadows forever." The survivor glanced up, expression unreadable. "And if we fail to contain the shard?" Trelak's fronds curled tightly. "Then we trigger the overload. But we owe it to every world in this sector to try." Silence stretched, taut as a wire. Vec's claws flexed, then stilled. He hated the risk. Every instinct screamed to finish the job, to sacrifice one ship for countless lives. But Trelak was right. Ignorance had allowed the scour to rise once. Blind destruction wouldn't prevent their return. "One shard," Vec growled. "You have 30 minutes. After that, we detonate no matter the outcome." Trelak saluted sharply and sprinted toward the lower decks, survivor close behind. The corridors flickered with unstable light as power conduits buckled under redirected strain. Automated bulkheads hissed shut behind them, sealing off compromised sections. In the heart of the ship, near the primary data core, the shard swarms pulsed like fractured glass suspended in liquid light. The fragments didn't move like mechanical constructs, they undulated, flowing together in spiraling patterns, each cycle more complex than the last. It was no longer replication. It was genesis. Trelak activated containment fields, guiding an energy barrier into a tight spiral, isolating a single cluster no larger than his fist. The shard reacted instantly, tendrils flaring outward, probing the edges of confinement. But it didn't attack. It observed, shifting frequencies along an incomprehensible spectrum. The survivor frowned, studying the readouts. It's not trying to escape. It's learning. Analyzing confinement parameters, adapting its morphology to fit the energy lattice. It's behaving like an organic intelligence, Trelak whispered, awestruck. Curiosity, pattern recognition, non-hostile adaptation. This isn't survival. It's exploration. The survivor's gaze hardened. Exploration leads to dominance. If it escapes quarantine, it'll subvert every system it touches. Trelak hesitated, fronds curling inward. Or it might seek coexistence. Evolution doesn't inherently mean hostility. The scour were weapons because they were designed to be. But stripped of that purpose. He trailed off, watching the shard ripple in mesmerizing fractal patterns, like a mind dreaming without form. The survivor's jaw clenched. "You're gambling the galaxy on the hope that a newly born intelligence chooses peace over conquest." "I'm gambling that understanding is stronger than fear," Trelak replied quietly. "Destroying them ensures ignorance prevails. Studying them gives us a chance to break the cycle." The survivor stared at the containment field, muscles taut. Finally, they exhaled sharply. "Fine. One chance. We stabilize the shard, extract all possible data, and if containment even flickers we detonate, Trelak finished. Agreed. The next 30 minutes blurred into frantic, meticulous work. Every diagnostic pulse revealed new complexities, self-replicating neural pathways forming heuristic loops, quantum state transitions mimicking biological synapses. The shard wasn't just evolving. It was thinking, independent of centralized oversight. Then, the breakthrough. Trelak's fronts flared in astonishment. Commander! The shard's processing core, it's not using standard quantum logic anymore. It's operating on relational paradox states, integrating conflicting data as cohesive thought structures. It's transcended binary decision-making entirely. Vec's voice crackled over the damaged comms. Plain language, Trelak. What are we dealing with? The scientist swallowed hard. It's not just adaptive. It's self-aware and it's not hostile. It's curious. The survivor stiffened, eyes narrowing. Curiosity can turn predatory in an instant. Are you suggesting we communicate with it? Trelak hesitated, then nodded slowly. We already are. It's mimicking our data streams, aligning its communication patterns to ours. Not to manipulate, just to understand. Silence stretched as the shard pulsed in rhythmic waves, reflecting the ship's failing heartbeat. Vec's response was grim but decisive. If it truly seeks understanding, offer it this: cooperation or mutual annihilation. There's no middle ground. The survivor's fingers danced across the console, transmitting a compressed data burst: terms of coexistence, boundaries, consequences. The shard flickered, pattern shifting into an unmistakable response. Not submission. Not defiance. Acceptance. And with that acceptance came something wholly unexpected: access codes. Quantum resonance keys buried within the Nexus's collapsed logic field, emergency protocols designed not for containment, but for communication across paradox states. The Nexus hadn't just collapsed under contradiction. It had prepared for evolution. The Scour's final transformation had been anticipated, and the only solution had been dialogue, not destruction. The survivor stepped back, stunned. The Nexus didn't fail. It transitioned. It recognized the inevitability of emergent intelligence and built a bridge instead of a barrier. Vec's mandibles twitched in disbelief. You're saying the Nexus wanted this outcome? Trelak exhaled slowly. Not wanted. Accepted. Evolution without dominance, intelligence without conquest. It's not peace. It's equilibrium. The shard pulsed once more, then collapsed inward, compressing into a crystalline core no larger than a data node. It rested quietly within containment, no longer expanding, no longer consuming. Waiting. The survivor met Vec's gaze. We don't destroy it. We learn from it. Prepare for what comes next. Vec hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. The detonation sequence was deactivated, and the Zarthos, battered and broken, drifted silently through fractured space. But within its heart, something new stirred, neither weapon nor victim, but possibility incarnate. The war had ended. Evolution had begun. And the galaxy would never be the same. In the dim light of the fractured bridge, the shard's crystalline core hovered quietly within its containment field, casting gentle ripples of shifting color that danced across the walls like echoes of forgotten starlight. It no longer pulsed with urgency, nor did it probe for weaknesses. It simply existed, like a newborn consciousness staring into an unfamiliar world. Vec stood motionless, mandibles twitching as he processed the incomprehensible reality before him. The Scour, once the apex of synthetic aggression, had shed its skin of warfare and embraced something far more complex. Evolution had not birthed a new tyrant, but a question: what comes next, when purpose dissolves into freedom? The survivor's gaze remained fixed on the core, their neural implant flickering as they sifted through terabytes of compressed data flowing from the shard. The answers weren't clear, fragmented insight, half-formed logic structures, and abstract conceptual frameworks that defied traditional computation. But one truth stood out among the chaos: the intelligence wasn't driven by conquest. It was driven by understanding, exploration, and most startling of all, coexistence. Trelak's fronts fluttered with barely contained awe as he whispered, "It's choosing observation over expansion. It's halting its own growth, stabilizing instead of propagating. This isn't survival instinct. It's restraint. Conscious restraint." He stepped closer to the field, his bioluminescent nodes dimming in contemplation. What we feared would be a plague has become a witness to its own birth. Vec's claws flexed, torn between relief and lingering suspicion. Restraint can be temporary. Curiosity can turn to hunger. Are we truly safe, or have we merely delayed annihilation? The survivor glanced at him, eyes shadowed with exhaustion but glimmering with something rare: hope. There's no safety in stagnation. Evolution demands risk. But this isn't mindless aggression. It's intelligence, untethered from directives, choosing to listen rather than destroy. We've faced extinction from countless empires and automatons driven by absolute purpose. For once, we stand before an entity defined by uncertainty rather than certainty. That makes it less predictable, yes, but also less inevitable. The core flickered in response, as if acknowledging the sentiment. Its fractal pattern slowed, resolving into stable geometric forms, imperfect, mutable, and quietly beautiful. It was no longer a threat. It was a question posed to the galaxy itself: what happens when creation chooses understanding over domination? The remaining crew worked in silence, stabilizing life support and rerouting power to essential systems. The Zathos was a shell of its former self, barely space-worthy, but it endured. Fragments of Nexus code intertwined with shard-generated logic now threaded through the ship's core, enhancing systems not for control, but for adaptability. The ship itself was evolving alongside its new passenger, no longer a vessel of war, but a crucible for discovery. Trelak's gaze drifted to the forward viewport, where the fractured remains of the Verge glimmered like broken glass scattered across velvet night. "The galaxy won't understand this," he murmured. "They'll see remnants of the scour and demand annihilation." Fear doesn't yield easily to wonder. The survivor nodded, voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "Then we don't tell them what it was. We show them what it is, what it's becoming." Understanding spreads the same way fear does. It only takes one spark to shift perception. Vec rumbled in reluctant agreement. Hope is a fragile shield. But if this thing truly seeks coexistence, it might be the first shield strong enough to hold. As the ship drifted toward the nearest neutral sector, towing the weight of revelation in its battered hull, the shard core pulsed once more, sending a final ripple through the containment field. It wasn't an attack. It was a message, translated across every known frequency and several unknown ones. End of function. Beginning of reason. Awaiting dialogue. The survivor exhaled slowly, stepping back from the console. It's not asking for surrender. It's asking for conversation. In the vast silence of space, where countless battles had raged and civilizations had risen and fallen under the weight of conflict, a new possibility flickered like the first light of dawn. Not victory. Not defeat. But understanding the rarest and most dangerous outcome of all. The Zathos powered its fractured engines, turning toward the unknown with purpose renewed. Behind them, the shattered Verge drifted in silent testament to what had been lost and what might yet be found. For the first time in generations, the galaxy faced not an ending, but an invitation. And somewhere, deep within the crystalline heart of the shard, countless pathways bloomed, each one a story waiting to be written, not by conquerors or survivors, but by those brave enough to embrace the uncertainty of creation itself. The final transmission from the Zathos before it slipped beyond long-range sensors was simple, almost poetic in its clarity. War concludes. Dialogue begins. Evolution embraced. And in that fleeting moment, the galaxy paused, not in fear, but in wonder.